What's happening, everybody, and welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff, and this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless Chaplaincy and my good friends at Care Portal. Care Portal is a technology platform that helps families who are at risk of entering into the foster care system stay together as a family so they connect people with people to get resources. They work with local churches and agencies to help families stay together. And we're so thankful for Care Portal, and we're thankful for their partnership in this podcast. And I'm excited for our conversation today. In fact, our next few episodes will be an interview with my friend Steve Carter, who was on the podcast earlier on in our season to talk about his book, The Thing Beneath the Thing. But Steve has a new book out called Grieve, Breathe, Receive, GBR, as he calls it. And Grieve, Breathe, Receive, this GBR journey that he invites us into is probably one of the most significant journeys I have encountered in going through a book. Steve is a pastor, but he also plays the role as like a spiritual guide through the realities of grief. And it's not just an instructional playbook on grief, but it is Steve's journey through his own grief that really sets the tone for this book. We're going to be going through the different elements of the book as we talk with Steve. But for this first episode, we're going to get a chance to hear from Steve, the heart behind Grieve, Breathe, and Receive, and really look at the question, what do you do when life does what it does? How do you respond to the moments of life that come at you and you weren't expecting them? Because we all go through moments of pain, hardship, broken expectations, frustrations. And how do you handle that? How do you actually learn to grieve well through it? In our previous podcasts, we've talked about grief and we've talked about the ways to experience or work through grief. But Steve comes at it from a very different angle, one that is relevant, one that is transformative, one that is helpful. And Steve really does in his book talk through some of the big struggles that he went through. He was at the top of his game at a church and that fell apart, and his dad died and he had to go through some seasons of brokenness in that. And he talks through how his grieve, breathe, receive process helped him and ultimately can help us as well. So I'm excited to get into it with Steve, and I'm excited for us to dive into it right now. Well, here we are again with Steve Carter, and we're excited to have Steve with us as we talk about his latest book, Grieve, Breathe, Receive, GBR, as he calls it in the book. And Steve, we're glad to have you.
Oh, I love being with you to talk about The Thing Beneath the Thing months ago. And so love what you're building here, Josh.
So we're going to jump in right away, Steve, for people who haven't read the book yet. What is it about GBR that, if you can give us just a flyover, that you want people to take away from reading it?
Yeah, I think the central question I was trying to answer is, what do you do when life does what it so often does? When it surprises you, when it shocks you, when it punches you in the gut. You didn't see this betrayal. You didn't see this affair. You didn't see getting fired. You didn't see the death of this dream. You didn't see the change. And at the heart of it was, I wanted, because I didn't know how to do this when my dream job fell apart, my dad passed 8 months later. I didn't know how to honor what comes up when change shows up. And I really just wanted to help people navigate through something that I think many of us, and often in the church, we don't do a great job of preparing our people for how to lament, how to grieve, how to hold space, or life's shocks and surprises.
That is such an important thing to think through, talk about. I heard it years ago. I think it was a pastor who said it. I don't remember his name. It might have been John Tyson. Okay.
Okay.
When I was in New York. But he said life comes at you sideways.
Mm.
And I love what I love about GBR is you are in fact saying, well, what do we do when life comes at us sideways? Like life is like, I love your language. Life is going to do what it does, but we don't know what to do when life does what it does. And I think for people who are entering into this conversation, we had a podcast after I talked with Steve for a bit on the thing beneath the thing. I interviewed a friend of mine to talk about grief, and she said that grief was unique and also universal. And so we all go through it, but we don't all go through it the same way. And what I love about GBR and I love about what you walk us through is you don't give us a template for how to grieve. You share your story of your own grief and your own learnings, and you allow us to think through our journey in your honesty.
Yeah, I think that your friend is spot on. It is universal, but it is unique. I mean, quote Kendrick Lamar, we grieve different. And I think that you have to be able to understand, man, how do I need to grieve? How do I need to honor this change?
Yeah.
How do I need to honor what is actually happening inside me? How do I slow down enough to make space for that? And I think that for many of us, we just have never been taught. And I think about it a little bit like Jenga. We have these moments of grief that could be a block. And when we don't process our grief, it's so easily to become a grievance. And we just build this tower of grievances.
Yeah.
And then when life comes at us sideways and it does what it so often does, that whole thing just collapses and we're left like holding these pieces. And it's not just this one unique moment. It's also having to make sense of all of the grievances we haven't had the courage, the space, the chance, to actually lean into. And that's my hope, is just to give people a framework to find themselves in the way of walking through the grief journey.
So as you're talking about Jenga, this was years ago. I had a friend and a therapist talk about EMDR, and so that, for those listening, that is a type of a therapeutic interventions process that helps people process through post-traumatic stress and things like that. But he essentially said we are made up of memories. Like our bodies are made of sinew and tissue and bone, but our souls are made up of memories. And if you have a memory that is unprocessed, it's basically just going to hang out there like a Jenga block that doesn't have a space.
Yeah.
And it isn't until you process through it that you can actually put it back in its proper place and it's stable then. And unfortunately, because most Americans, most human beings, but specifically most Americans, they don't have a context for grief and they don't have the patience for process. They cope with unhealthy or at least unproductive strategies, whether that's drinking or Netflix or whatever you want to do. And therefore the grief goes unprocessed, and it just becomes these memories become these things that just hang out. They just hang out and we don't know what to do with them. And after a while, you're in real trouble because you will grieve. You will grieve. But if you don't grieve well, your grief will get the better of you.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. And, I've been really trying to discern, like, why is that? Like, why is it that for many of us, it is an easier coping strategy to, use Netflix or shopping or overeating or drinking or any destructive pattern, like to help us like self-regulate quicker.
Yeah.
But you're not actually dealing with the grief. You're just escaping the feeling of it, and rent's going to be due at some point on that grief, and you're going to have to face it. So the question is like, why? And I'd really be curious, like because of what you uniquely are doing with your career and the way that you coach and pastor and lead, like my working theory is we have such an issue with control.
Yeah.
And so my job is trying to manage my grief, manage my life, and to never be out of control. And when I have to pick up those Jenga pieces, in one sense, I feel out of control because I'm like, I don't know if this emotion's going to take over.
Yeah.
I don't know if what this feeling's going to bring up. So I'd rather just try to keep it underneath the surface rather than allow myself to experience that feeling of being a little bit out of control.
Yeah.
I don't know. How would you answer that?
Yeah. So it reminds me a lot of something that John Mark Comer wrote in the middle of the pandemic. He wrote like an ebook on holy uncertainty. Did you listen to that at all?
I did not. No.
So he went through a whole thing about our need for control and why we control. And that I forget, I think Americans only control about 15% of what they think they control. Yeah. And that COVID and the pandemic forced us to come to terms with the reality that we are not in control. There are so many aspects of life that we cannot control. And throughout human history, the tendency in a space where you do not have control is to hyper focus on what you can control.
That's right.
And so if I can't control the fact that my dad is dying, all right. So my dad has Parkinson's. My dad has cancer. I cannot control what this disease or these diseases are doing to him. It is easier for me to control what my garage looks like, or what my basement looks like, or what project I'm going to work on, or what cocktail I'm going to think through, or what brisket, recipe am I going to use from that? It's easier for me to do that because I have power over those, but it doesn't take away the fact that I don't have power over like life. And his whole point, John Mark Comer's point, was there is a holiness to uncertainty. Yep. And when you are not in control, that is the prime opportunity to put yourself into the hands of a God who is and is in charge of this situation. Because even the word control has like a negative connotation to it. But if God is in charge of this, and he's good and he's loving, then that's an opportunity for me to trust. But most people can't get there.
Yeah.
So I think that's one part of it. I actually think there's another element, and I think you and I maybe talked about this years ago before the pandemic, but I think there's a theological problem with the church. And I don't mean this as a criticism. I mean this as just a curious moment. During the 90s and into the 2000s, there was this idea that Jesus could make you successful. Jesus could make you a better parent. Jesus could make you a better business person. Jesus could make you a better human. Jesus could make you successful in your life. And we preached that. We built sermons around that. For 20 years, we found appealing and sexy ways to say, Jesus and following Jesus will make you successful. And you know what, Steve? That's not wrong.
Right.
That is not untrue. It's a biblical principle that if you do in fact walk in the ways of the Lord, you are going to have a better life. The problem is that that's only half of the equation, and success will only get you so far. This is the reason why men in their 40s, late 40s, moving up into their 50s, have the highest risk of suicide in the United States. Because what happens when you're in your 40s? Well, you pretty much get to the top of the ladder that you're going to get to. I mean, most men get to the point where it's like, I have built my career. I have made the amount of money I'm going to make. Maybe I'll become a VP. Maybe I'll become a CEO, but then I'm just basically trading one job for another because I'm about as high as I'm going to get. I mean, that's where I am. I can't literally get any higher in my career than where I'm at right now. And so then when success only gets you so far, and then you have life come at you sideways, and all of a sudden you don't have a context for what you're going through because all you've been doing in following Jesus is trying to be successful. Well, then you're going to fall short. Mm-hmm. And I think GBR and what you're talking about is there's a difference between success and wholeness. And it's true, Jesus will make you successful, but Jesus will actually make you whole.
That's right.
And wholeness, if we go by Chuck DeGroat's language, wholeheartedness is actually what God designed us for. And I think that's I think those two things, Steve, I think are the missing components and why it's why we don't preach on grief. It's why we don't preach on lament, because grief isn't sexy. Lament isn't sexy. You can't build a sermon series around it. It's not appealing. You preach grief and people are like, I don't want to listen to this. I want to come to church to be inspired and motivated and happy. And I want to be successful. Yeah. But you can't be whole without pain either.
Right. Right. I think you're onto something, because I think in the church world, you know, you've probably seen this at the gym, like where there are guys who, I mean, their arms and their chest are just massive, but you can tell that they've skipped leg day. You know, they just got chicken legs. I feel like we have done such a great job on Sunday mornings around celebration and hope. You know, Sunday's coming. And much of it is because of the state of the world. You get on the news, you have so much coming at you. You have so much of life coming at you sideways.
Yeah.
That we've tried to use this hour to 90 minutes as almost like a respite from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But I think unfortunately is we haven't given our people the spiritual muscle to actually know how to lament and know how to grieve. Yeah. And so when COVID hit, it actually showed us how little many churches had actually prepared its people, because, and I think a lot of people were like, do I even really need this? Because when my back was up against a wall, the stuff I was relying on didn't help me through this.
Nope.
It actually like created more questions and cognitive dissonance. Yeah. And so I think that's part of like the inkling for me was, and I just want to, as a pastor, I want to help people be prepared for when life does what it does, because it's going to do what it does. It's going to come at us sideways.
And so that was part one of our conversation with Steve Carter. And as you can tell, Steve is a man who speaks from experience, not only experience in sitting with, pastoring, and listening to people who've gone through significant grieving journeys, but also a man who has walked through it himself. And I really appreciated his perspective when it came to saying, you know what, life is going to do what it does. It's going to come at you. It's going to be hard. And how you view God and how you view what he's doing in your life, that's going to make a big difference in that grieving journey. And ultimately, how you have gone through suffering in the past, that's going to make a difference too. And so in our next episode, we're going to continue on that conversation with Steve, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what it means to see the world through a different perspective, to see the world through the hope of the resurrection, and yet at the same time still live in a reality where things aren't the way they should be. And how do we navigate? How do we navigate that tension well. If this was a helpful podcast to you, I just encourage you to share it with a friend. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about grief, or you'd like to tap into Steve's book or explore that a little bit, we've actually got a link to the book in the podcast notes and more information about Steve as well. Thank you so much for listening in, and we will talk with you later.